Week 2 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers. I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Ja'Marr Chase. Ja'Marr Chase, week 1, he didn't show up. This Bengal offense didn't do much, but they came out with the victory at the Cleveland Browns in week 1. But Ja'Marr Chase, we know he's a great talent. First pick overall in just about every fantasy league. And this week versus the Jaguars, I think he bounces back. Number 2, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. Good matchup this week versus the Giants. Last week he had a good game in terms of numbers versus Philly, but obviously a lot of drop passes at the end of that game where Dallas had a chance to win. And CeeDee Lamb, if he caught all those passes, would have had over 200 yards in that ball game. But Lamb, like I said, he still put up fantasy numbers last week. This week, a great matchup versus the Giants, a team he has a great track record against. And I think this week he goes out there, has a good one. Number 3, Puka Nacua of the Los Angeles Rams. Puka Nacua last week, he got busted open, hit in the head, left the game a couple times, still finished with 10 catches, 130 yards in that matchup versus the Texans. And this week, a good matchup with the Tennessee Titans, where I think he could exploit that secondary. Number 4, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So Justin Jefferson last week, slow start. It was for him and J.J. McCarthy. Then in the second half, this offense got going and woke up, and Jefferson found the end zone. So it doesn't matter who his quarterback is. The numbers are going to be there most weeks than not. Like I said, I know he got off to a slow start in that game, but then McCarthy got it going, and this offense was moving the football up and down the field. Number 5, Malik Nabers of the New York Giants. This week, a great matchup at the Dallas Cowboys for Malik Nabers and this Giant team. This Cowboy defense isn't good. Last week we saw, obviously, Philly moved the ball up and down the field on them. And Malik Nabers, after a bad week last week with drops and only 4 catches, 55 yards, I think he goes out there this week, bounces back, and has a big performance. Number 6, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. So a lot of stud receivers had down week 1s, and St. Brown and this line offense as a whole was totally down last week. But this week, a good matchup versus the Bears. We just saw J.J. McCarthy go into Soldier Field, have a big ball game. So I think this offense gets back on track. And we know Detroit, they're a better home team than they've been on the road. Number 7, Brian Thomas Jr. of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Brian Thomas last week, if it wasn't for that rushing touchdown, he really would have had no production. This week, it's a matchup at Cincinnati where they're going to have to throw the ball early and often. They're going to have to drive the football down the field if they want to compete with this Bengal offense. And I think Brian Thomas is going to be a big part of it, because this Bengal defense isn't any good. But like I said, their offense is going to put up points in a hurry, and Thomas is going to have to be a big part of them putting those points up. This week, number 8, Nico Collins of the Houston Texans. Nico Collins, a bad game for him as well last week. Only 3 catches, 25 yards versus the Rams. But he's a pro wide receiver. He's going to bounce back. This Tampa Bay secondary, middle of the pack, in my opinion. And Nico Collins, he's a stud wideout. So last week was just a down week overall, like I said, for a lot of wideouts. And Collins, I think, bounces back, and pretty much he's the only target over there. Christian Kirk banged up already. Jaden Higgins, he's a rookie. They don't expect much. And Xavier Hutchinson, only his second year, they don't expect much as well. Number 9, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. So we'll see if London plays in this game, and if he does, he's a top 10 option to me this week. Not a great matchup in Minnesota, but we saw the Bears, they had open opportunities in that game, but Caleb Williams missed a lot of throws. So Drake London, him and Penix have a good rapport down from late last season, early into this season in training camp. And like I said, if that shoulder is fine and he's out there, Drake London weekly, he's a top 10, 12 option. Number 10, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. So maybe I'm higher on Wilson than other people are, but Garrett Wilson, we've seen it throughout his NFL career, and that's why he got paid the nice contract in the offseason, was Garrett Wilson from the New York Jets to re-sign, because it doesn't matter who the quarterback's been for Garrett Wilson. He puts up numbers, and last week, once again, a big game. So this week in a game where the Jets, they're going to have to chase points early and often, most likely versus Buffalo, even though this Jet defense, the last 4 or 5 outings versus this Bill team, has gone out there, especially at home in MetLife Stadium, and played this offense well. But like I said, Garrett Wilson, pretty much the only target in the passing game for this Jet team. And this week, I like him as a top 10 option. 11, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. A.J. Brown, it was a bad week for him last week. He couldn't separate from the Dallas secondary, which I think isn't a good unit at all over there in Dallas. But this week, Super Bowl matchup, juices be flowing. Big rematch, obviously. And A.J. Brown, it's rare to see him have 2 bad games in a row. So after last week, it was the opener. Guys come out flat, or whatever the case may be. I think this week, like I said, they can be more energized as Philadelphia. And I think A.J. Brown bounces back. Number 12, Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Last week, a big game it was for JSN, and he's that type of receiver as well. It doesn't matter who his quarterback is. I think he's going to go out there and get his numbers regardless, because we saw they traded DK Metcalf without hesitation and made JSN the number one over there. So this week in Pittsburgh, a team that just got torched by the New York Jet offense, even though I don't see that happening again this week, I still think JSN is a great option. Weekly 13 staying in the same game, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. This is a revenge game for DK Metcalf. You know, he wanted to stay in Seattle, get a nice contract extension, and they didn't want to pay the man, so they traded him off, obviously, Metcalf, to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Metcalf last week, I thought it was a decent debut for him with Pittsburgh. 4 catches, 83 yards. And this week, like I said, versus former team, the Seattle Seahawks, you know, he's going to have extra motivation in this one. And I think he could go out there and possibly hit 100 and a touch. 14, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. Ladd McConkey in this receiving room tore up a great secondary in the Kansas City Chiefs last week. So McConkey, we know he can run the routes. We know he has great hands. We know Keenan Allen's back there. We know Quentin Johnston had a big ball game. But I think Ladd McConkey's still the number one guy and most consistent guy over there in Los Angeles. So last week, where it was a middle-of-the-pack game for him, for his standards, still had 13 fantasy points in PPR leagues. This week, a good matchup at the Raiders, 15, Davante Adams of the Los Angeles Rams. So last week, it was a light game for Adams in his debut with his new team, 4 catches, 51 yards. But there's going to be games where both these guys, in Puka Nacua and Adams, have weeks, and then there's going to be games where one of them goes off and the other guy has a mediocre performance like we saw last week. So this week at Tennessee, I think Adams has a better game, and him and Stafford still trying to lock in and get rapport down. 16, Mike Evans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Mike Evans, we know he's in his 12th season in the NFL. And at some point, numbers are going to decline, obviously, for Evans, but he's still a deep ball threat. He still could run the routes, and obviously a matchup problem with his height and jump ball ability. So this week at Houston, pretty solid defense. They held that good Ram offense to 14 points. I think Mike Evans still could go out there and be productive. 17, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So last week was a coming out party for Zay Flowers entering his 3rd season. Over 140 yards, found the end zone. Yard after catch, he went out there and made big plays for this Baltimore Raven team in a tough 41-40 loss. And this week, I know it's a little bit of a tougher matchup where Denzel Ward possibly could cover him majority of this game. But after what I saw from last week, I think Zay Flowers definitely could take the next step entering his 3rd season, and especially after a tough loss like this Baltimore Raven team, they're going to try to keep finding ways to get him the football with the impact he could have on a game. 18, Marvin Harrison Jr. of the Arizona Cardinals. Marvin Harrison last week over 80 yards, found the end zone. Him and Kyler Murray all off-season long have been working on rapport, getting the football in the good spots for Marvin to go out there and make plays. And this season, entering his 2nd season after a big week 1 and a good matchup this week versus the Carolina Panthers. I think Marvin Harrison could go out there, have another good performance. 19, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So maybe I'm lower on T. Higgins than other people are, but he is the number 2 wide receiver, obviously, over there in Cincinnati. Ja'Marr Chase, the number 1 wide receiver, going to get a bunch of targets, going to get a lot of looks, especially in the red zone. And Higgins last week had a bad game. I know Ja'Marr Chase did as well for the Cincinnati Bengal team, and this week a much better matchup versus the Jaguars, but I'm just a little bit lower on consensus than Higgins. Like I said, most of these other guys are number 1 options in their offense, where Higgins, it could be hit or miss type of weeks. Number 20, Tetairoa McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. I thought McMillan had a decent debut, 5 catches, 68 yards in his first NFL game for McMillan, the rookie for this Carolina Panther team. And I've said it, there's not many other options in this offense. Chuba Hubbard, I know they got Xavier Legette, but he really hasn't done much last season, training camp and so far this season. So this week in a decent matchup at Arizona, I think McMillan with his size and speed could go out there and have a decent game once again. 21, Tyreek Hill of the Miami Dolphins. So Tyreek Hill, his numbers have definitely declined over the last couple seasons, and now in week 1 he was arguing with teammates, arguing with coaches. Only 4 catches, 40 yards. It was a terrible offensive performance all the way around at Indianapolis for Miami. And Tyreek Hill could be a trade candidate either to Kansas City or Pittsburgh is the rumor right now near the trade deadline. But this week with an okay matchup versus New England, maybe Hill could get things going and this offense could get in sync. And they don't want to fall to 0-2, especially in the home opener. 22, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So Egbuka had a breakout first game of his NFL career, finding the end zone twice. Him and Baker Mayfield already look locked in, going out there, making plays. Like I said, 2 big touchdowns last week in the come-from-behind victory at the Atlanta Falcons. So Ibuka, he was a first-round pick for a reason. I know maybe some people are higher on Ibuka than I am, but I'm going to pump the brakes just a little bit. And also Mike Evans is still the number 1 wide receiver over there. And this week, a tougher matchup for Houston than it was last week versus the Atlanta Falcons. So with those factors, Ibuka is still a solid number 2 wide receiver for owners this week. 23, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So McLaurin quickly dropping down my ranking board. And I didn't like Terry McLaurin coming into the season. Like I said, that holdout definitely was going to do him in a little bit. And we saw it last season with Brandon Ayuk. He held out all the training camp, came in late to the regular season. His production was down. He tore the ACL, and obviously he's still out, is Brandon Ayuk. And this week it's a tougher matchup at Green Bay. Solid defense, obviously, and McLaurin still doesn't have his legs all the way under him. And Deebo Samuel getting in those reps in training camp has helped him take a head start in this receiving room. 24, Travis Hunter of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Maybe I'm higher on Hunter than consensus. Hunter last week, he was all over the field, played some corner, but a receiver, the targets were there for Hunter, and he just missed. Play was Hunter, where J.C. Horn jumped the route where it was a little bit underthrown, because if it got over his head, Hunter was gone for a 50-plus yard touchdown in that one. So this week in a matchup at Cincinnati, where there's going to be a lot of points scored, I think Hunter could go out there and be a solid number 2 wide receiver for fantasy owners this week. 25, Jacoby Myers of the Vegas Raiders. So Jacoby Myers last week, it was a good game versus former team, the New England Patriots. We know he requested a trade in training camp. Obviously, that request was denied. He's still now with this Vegas Raider team, and he could have a big game this week versus Chargers, especially if Brock Bowers is out of the lineup. Something to monitor and keep an eye on. But like I said, Myers is the number 1 wide receiver over there. They don't have much going on in the receiving room. I know they got Jack Beck, Dante Thornton, who's a young rookie as well, but Jacoby Myers easily the number 1 wide receiver for this Las Vegas Raider team. And so far, him and Geno Smith have good rapport. 26, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, ceiling's a little bit capped, I think, in this offense. Him and Caleb Williams couldn't connect last season. Week 1, more of the same inaccurate throws, timing routes are off. And DJ Moore took a big hit as well, where he's definitely banged up in the rib area, I believe. But this week, a matchup at Detroit, a team he's had a good track record against. And, this Bear team, they're going to try to clean things up. And Ben Johnson wants to beat the team where he was the offensive coordinator for the Lions. I think DJ Moore is a back-end 2-3 receiver. Decent option this week. 27, Ricky Pearsall, San Francisco 49ers. So Pearsall last week had a nice game. This week, a good matchup in New Orleans. And he's the last man standing in the receiving room. Brandon Ayuk, we know he's still out. Jawan Jennings, he's banged up with his shoulder. I don't think he's going to play in this ball game, and even if he does, he's not going to be 100%. And now George Kittle, he's out at least 4 games with the hamstring. So Pearsall with a good matchup in New Orleans, and it might be Mac Jones in their quarterback or Purdy. I still think he's just going to get peppered with targets where there's not a reliable option really in the receiving room unless Jennings plays. But like I said, he's not going to be 100%. 28, Keon Coleman of the Buffalo Bills. So Keon Coleman had his coming out party last week with a big touchdown down the stretch with 4 minutes left to cut it down to a 1-score ball game versus the Baltimore Ravens. And Keon Coleman, I thought last season was going to be solid, but now entering his second season and a lot of off-the-field practicing and training this offseason to get better for the season. It definitely showed in Week 1, and this week a tougher matchup at the Jets in terms of possibly Sauce Gardner covering him in this ball game, even though last week was a tough match, but he went out there over 100 yards and scored a touchdown. 29, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs, another wide receiver who's banged up on a crossing route, banged shoulders with Travis Kelce, and he's day-to-day now with the dislocated shoulder. But Xavier Worthy, we know, one of the quicker guys in the NFL. I don't think he's a true number 1 wide receiver, and this is a tough matchup as well, even if he plays where he won't be 100% versus Philly secondary. I still think Worthy, with his speed and upside of possibly being the number 1 guy in this Chief offense, if he plays this week, could be a fringe 2 receiver. 30, Jerry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns. So Jerry Jeudy, him and Flacco have a good rapport. And Judy's always been a solid receiver when he actually has a quarterback that can spread the field, and he's not scared to take the chances. So this week in Baltimore, we know they're most likely going to be trailing early and often have to chase points. And Jerry Jeudy last season had the breakout year. 90 catches, 1,200 yards and a touchdown. And this week in Baltimore, I think he could go out there and be a decent number 3 wide receiver. 31, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. So getting those first team reps when Terry McLaurin held out in training camp definitely paid off, and we saw it in week 1 where Deebo had a big ball game versus the New York Giants. But this week, a very tough matchup with the Green Bay Packers, a great defense that just shut down Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jameson Williams. They didn't do nothing in that game. And Deebo Samuel, the thing with him has been health throughout his career. When healthy, he's a solid wide receiver and a guy who can line up in a lot of spots in a formation. But this week at Green Bay, I'm going to temper expectations a little bit. 32, Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. So last week, Nico Collins, this defense shut down to 3 catches, 25 yards, and Ridley had a tough matchup as well versus the Broncos, waiting too much. This offense, it's going to be a tough year, even with the first overall pick, Cam Ward in there, quarterback. But Calvin Ridley, as the year goes on and rapport gets down with Ward, I think we'll start moving up the rankings. But like I said, after this Ram team shut down Collins, who's a way more talented wide receiver than Calvin Ridley. I don't see a high ceiling for Ridley this week. 33, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. So last week in his Cowboy debut, pretty much a quiet game for Pickens, 3 catches, 30 yards. He felt more like a decoy out there than actually a guy who's going to go out there and make plays, where Dak Prescott kept peppering CeeDee Lamb with targets and Javonte Williams had a good game out of the backfield. But if it's any week Pickens could get on track, it's this week versus the Giants, a bad secondary. We saw Deebo Samuel go off for a big game versus them last week. And if, like I said, Pickens, though, you just don't know what you're going to get. We saw that in Pittsburgh with him, and now with Dallas, it seems like the same thing where consistency could be a problem. 34, Hollywood Brown of the Kansas City Chiefs. So last week, it was a great game for Brown. 10 catches, 99 yards in that one, especially when Worthy went out early with the shoulder injury. And this week, a very tough matchup versus Philadelphia. I know they lost some guys in the secondary. Darius Slay, obviously the biggest piece, going to the Pittsburgh Steelers. Gardner Johnson gone as well. But still, this team could cover, especially with the youngster Mitchell, already one of the better corners in the league entering his second season. So Hollywood Brown, like I said, no doubt last week was a big game for him. But this week, I don't see him duplicating those type of numbers. 35, staying in the same game, Super Bowl rematch. Devonta Smith to the Philadelphia Eagles. So Devonta Smith, I think his ceiling's capped as well in this offense. We saw last week the receivers did nothing. A.J. Brown, Devonta Smith. It was all Jalen Hurts, Saquon Barkley, and Dallas Goedert was the top target in the receiving game last week. So this week with a tough matchup versus a way better secondary in Kansas City than what he versed last week in the Dallas Cowboys. I think he's a number 3 wide receiver option in Smith, and the 36th and final receiver I'm ranking is Chris Olave, New Orleans Saints. So Chris Olave, last week he was peppered with targets. He just escaped injury once again, and that's been the problem, unfortunately, with Olave. A lot of injuries over the last couple seasons. So Chris Olave, we know he could go out there. We know he could make plays, but also as well, he don't have a good quarterback in Spencer Rattler, where he's going to be erratic all season long. And this week with a tough matchup versus San Francisco 49er defense, I don't think Olave does much more than a number 3 wide receiver for fantasy owners. That's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 2 of the fantasy football season.